Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hi, and welcome to Reloscope, the Relationship Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm Marie Stella, your host from Melbourne, Australia. Let's start the show. Welcome back to the show. It's commonplace in long-term relationships to have fights, arguments, good times, along with the bad, and sometimes it's really, really bad. And it is human nature to be more affected by the bad parts. That being said, having that residual stress from issues long in the past can weigh on your relationship. So today we're speaking to Kerry Lumbu, co-director and therapist at Motivating Marriages, for some information and advice on this department. Hi, Kerry. Thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So could you share with us a bit more about your journey through pursuing psychology and how you ended up specializing in relationships?
Yes, my journey to becoming a psychologist probably started, I would say, at conception of my life. I came out of the womb studying human beings, and so I can't even imagine doing anything else for a job. It's all I've ever done for as long as I can remember is look at human behaviour and particularly human relationships, so how people relate to one another. So when people ask the question, how did I know I wanted to be a psychologist? It was as simple as this is what I was born to do. So it was a beeline straight from high school into university into psychology. And I started off actually with a real fascination of abnormal psychology and studied psychology and criminology at university before going on to working in the forensic sort of situation. Mm-hmm. And that in particular was really interesting, but I found when I was working in the forensic situation, so working in the prison system, that a lot of the dysfunction that we see in human behaviour can stem back to early life experiences, the way that we've been nurtured and brought up in our environments. And so subsequently, I left the prison system wanting to work in private practice and then went into private practice with my husband, who's also a psychologist. And then we were in private practice doing individual psychological interventions for probably about 7 or 8 years. And the idea of, again, that the people that were coming in for individual therapy, we could see that their distress was very connected to their relationships. So whether it was where they've come from where they're from their family of origin, or whether they were coming in and telling their story of dissatisfaction and unhappiness through the lens of being unhappy in their relationships. And so subsequently, out of our first business, Motivating Minds, we actually developed our sister company, Motivating Marriages, where we work specifically at trying to help couples to create a home environment that's not only safe and secure for them as adults, but then provides a nice, safe environment emotionally for children to grow up in. So we wanted to work at that sort of primary level of intervention. And so that's how we ended up down the pathway of couples therapy.
That's amazing and such an interesting, adorable love story. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Now, we'd also like to get to know you a bit better, if you don't mind. So this is, have you met Kerry? What do you like to do in your spare time?
My spare time is really made up of spending time at our rural property where we are trying to live off-grid in our downtime. I don't know. At the moment, I'm just like building a little cubby house to house our toilets and things like that. So I really enjoy being outdoors, fall driving, fishing, boating, that sort of stuff. I love my job, but when I'm not doing it, I want to be away in nature.
That sounds incredibly tranquil. And do you live in the city or close to the city?
Yeah, so we live in suburbs in Sydney, Sydney suburbs, and then our rural property is really quite far away. It's quite isolated where you can't see anyone or speak to anyone, and that's just perfection for
Oh
me.
yeah, for sure. I imagine it must be really nice to be able to get away for the weekend or something, especially in Sydney. So do you read any books? Do you bring any with you along your trips?
I do, but I'm a bit of a nerd, so I pretty much only read psychology textbooks. So I have to sort of force myself into reading anything other than professional works. Um, so yeah, that's pretty much all I do.
Well, to be fair, I totally understand that like when you're so interested in something, a specific subject, it's hard
Yeah,
to focus on anything else. It's like
yeah,
nothing else really matters.
yeah,
So like I totally get that.
yeah.
Do you have a favorite psychology book that you've read so far?
Um, do I have a favorite psychology book? No, not really. I just springboard from one to the other. So I'll read one and then that'll just shoot me off in another different direction. And so currently I'm sort of down the rabbit hole of studying ASD and how the autism spectrum affects interpersonal relationship functioning. So, yeah, not a particular one. I love them all. I think they're fantastic and they just help my mind springboard off from one topic to another so I can just deepen my understanding of human behavior.
That's amazing. What about films? Are there any that you've watched recently?
Yes, but I couldn't tell you the name. So one thing about my brain, it's a little bit quirky. My husband thinks I'm wonderful value when it comes to movies because I can watch the same movie 10 times and still have no idea what actually happened. So, um, yeah, the only
Yeah.
one I can actually remember watching was the new Top Gun, and that
Yeah.
was awesome. And I watched it 3 times. It was
Yeah.
fantastic.
Is it just this like, so I do get that with movies sometimes. Is it this experience where you're like watching a movie, but your mind's not really there? It's like thinking about something else, and then you kind of have no idea what's going on in the movie.
I don't have so much that. I'm very there in the movie, but my brain just goes, that's irrelevant. I don't need to retain it. Um,
That's fair enough. That's fair enough because you've got like all these psychology books to retain the
Retain.
information from. So I like your priorities are straight. But is there a podcast that you listen to?
No, I'm sorry. I
No.
hadn't listened to one of these ones. Whenever I get invited to go on a
Yeah.
podcast, I listen, so I
Yeah.
know what I'm getting myself into. But apart from that, no, I'm just, as I said, I nerded up the whole way. Books, books, books. Yeah,
Don't be sorry about that at all. And also, it's another thing of like some people retain information better when they're reading too, rather than listening. And I happen to, well, I need both. So I do a bit of both. Um, so I totally get it. Sometimes like podcasts aren't something that I can just tune into and think about all the time. My last question for you is who do you look up to the most?
again, like I'm a bit of a non-event here. I don't really have people that I look up to. I think I respect people, no names in particular, but respect people who have dedicated their life to a particular skill and they've mastered it, but they've also done that with humility. So, yeah, they've become experts at what they do, but they do it with humility and not with pride. So, yeah, that's
Yeah.
pretty much the sort of people I look up to.
Definitely, I get you there. And those people, like, they have the confidence too. And it's just incredible the way they work. So it's really just fascinating to watch them grow in their careers as well. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I feel like we got to know each other. Well, I got to know you a bit better. Now we're moving on to now we're moving on to the interview section. And my first question for you is, what is a relationship? How would you describe a relationship?
In the human sense, I suppose it's just any connection between two people, or more. Could be between more people, but yeah, I think it can go from anywhere from an interaction that you have at a checkout with somebody who is organizing a transaction for you, right through to your most deep and intimate relationship. But yeah, relationship, the way I see it, is any connection between two or more people.
For sure. And in the context of a romantic relationship, in your opinion, does it still hold the same meaning, structure, and importance as decades ago?
Look, not having lived decades ago, it's probably a little bit hard to know. But I think the general consensus among people is that there's a lot more expectation in romantic relationships these days, because of the changes in our social structures. So we're moving away from community-based supports and connections and families, even into more sort of solitary type relationships. And so therefore the expectations that we may have had on extended family or friends and things in the past, we tend to be placing a lot of that expectation on our partner and hoping that they will tick all of those boxes. So I think that's where some of the challenges lie in relationships at the present point.
For sure. And how would you define relationship stress? What kind of effect does it have on a relationship, and what does it really mean?
Yeah. I think relationship stress could be internal. So it could be something that the relationship itself is actually dealing with. So for example, the challenge of raising and parenting children would be a relationship stressor. But one of the things that we also look at is external stress and how that feeds into the relationship. So I think most simply put, it's probably two parts. There's either internal relationship stress or external relationship stress. And then if you want to sort of break it down even further internally, it's then the stress management abilities or stress coping abilities that the two individuals have within the relationship. So how they independently manage their own personal stress. So I think there's lots and lots of areas that stress can come from in a relationship.
Right. And based on what you've just shared with me, I'm going to guess that relationship history is probably it probably falls under internal stress. How might this contribute to how a relationship unfolds?
Yeah. So if I can clarify, you're talking about relationship history there and relationship stress?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
correct.
Yeah. So I think that it's probably helpful for people to understand that the work that I do, so I work in intensive couples marathon therapy, which is a 2-day therapy process where I spend 2 days with clients back to back. And the vast majority of work that I actually do there is helping couples repair from what we call emotional injuries that they have sustained in their relationship. So it's not at all uncommon for couples to wait on average about 6 years of experiencing significant relationship stress before they come and get help from a couples therapist.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's a lot. That's a long time of stress.
it is.
And so you being the therapist, being there to help them through these um these stresses and like all of the emotional injuries, do you notice like is there a noticeable difference in the just kind of what's the word I'm looking for? The the emotional well-being of someone when they have healed those emotional injuries.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. It's palatable. Like when you see a couple heal from their emotional injuries, it's pure magic as far as I'm concerned. Like it's a beautiful space to share with a couple when they have actually been able to work through something that they've been holding on to, in some cases for like 20 years.
mhm.
And it's caused them so much heartache and so much pain. And for them to process through that and come out the other end of that, feeling what we call a real felt sense of being heard, understood, empathized with, and what we would refer to as then developing like a secure sense of attachment and connection with their partner. So
Yeah.
there's nothing quite like seeing that happen in a couple. It's a really beautiful thing to experience.
Could you paint us a picture of what it looks like before versus after?
Absolutely. So then There's a term that the Gottman Institute refers to, which is called negative sentiment override. So this is where the couple have gotten into a state where their perception of their relationship and their partner is negative. So they're on guard, they're waiting to be disappointed, to be hurt, they're hypervigilant to relationship threat like criticism and things like that. And so when they come into couples therapy, if there's been a history of emotional injury that hasn't been resolved, then they become quite hypervigilant to this threat and they're in a state of negative sentiment override, which means to look at them, they are very guarded. They're very snappy. They're very hostile. They're jumping in and cutting each other off and reacting with really hot emotions. And then as we take them through the process of healing those emotional injuries, we see a real softening of their interactions with one another, an openness to hearing the other person and seeing their point of view, a letting down of that defensive guard that's inhibiting their ability to connect with one another.
That does sound beautiful. And I think I have seen like the before picture in some of my friends where they, for some reason, they are able to communicate what they're going through with their partner, but instead of communicating with their partner, they're communicating it to me. Um, and then with their partner, they communicate, but in a completely different way, in a way where their partner doesn't really want to hear it because it might sound hostile. So that's what I kind of imagine that to be. What are some signs that couples are experiencing this stress from, like, for example, a complex relationship history?
Yeah, I think the biggest sign of that being part of a relationship is the reactivity of the couple. So if we're feeling like we're constantly having to defend ourselves, or if we're feeling like we're constantly under criticism, and then when our partner sort of says something and we're really sensitive to tone of voice, facial expressions, and we're just really on edge a lot of the time, this would indicate that the relationship is in that sort of negative state and that there is likely to be a history of things going on there where they've sustained emotional injuries. They might not be able to pinpoint what those are, but their current sort of presentation in the relationship is indicative of the fact that they're injured and they're subsequently on guard and defensive.
All right. And are there any like first steps to making this work before identifying the source of the problem?
Yeah. So first steps to making it. Sorry, what do you mean by that question?
Sorry. I meant like what are the first steps to take in order to solve this issue?
To solve
Yeah.
it, yeah. So I think like identifying that it's an issue is probably the first step. The way to probably do that, to give couples an idea of what I actually do when we do an assessment, is we actually get the clients to report to us what is the history of their relationship. So how did you meet? When did you meet? What were some of the highs and lows at the beginning part of your relationship? And we go through all the major significant events that have occurred. So their dating period, getting engaged, their commitment, whatever that is. The transition to parenthood is enormous. Like the research shows us that 2/3 of couples' relationships significantly decline during when they transition into becoming parents. And so for a lot of couples, there's usually a lot of wounding there. So I would say that most couples could actually ask themselves, how did we go in terms of our relationship when we transitioned into becoming parents? And so it's just tracking through the course of your relationship and just looking at the journey that you've been on together and isolating for yourselves, like, was there any pain points? That's what I refer to with my clients. Was there any pain points there? And it can be as something as like innocuous as, oh, I don't know, like I can have couples that come in who have been together for 30 years and they've got really low trust in their relationship. And it stems back to when they were dating, but they weren't official. There was another girl around. And so one night we decided that we had a fight and we were going to separate for the night and go our separate ways. One person interpreted that as we were no longer together. one person interpreted it as we were just having a night off.
Right.
So the one person who interpreted it the other way went and hooked up with the other person. And then this has just been the underlying factor of their relationship. And they've built their entire relationship on this thing that
the good old Rachel and Ross.
Exactly. That's a perfect example. Yeah.
That's what it should be called.
You were on a great pain point.
Yeah, the Rachel and Ross.
And so it's, just tracing through your relationship and identifying like, were there any pain points? And as I said, they can be big ones, but they can actually be quite small. Like the first time that you were sick, did your partner support you, or did they go out with their mates or their girlfriends that night?
Yeah.
And that determines whether or not I can trust this person. So identifying just where you're holding on to little pain points, and then in the midst of conflict, or in the aftermath of conflict, when you're reviewing what's actually happened, does your mind go anywhere? Does it go back to the history and to any particular points where you felt let down in a similar sort of way by your partner? And if your mind does that, then there's a good chance that there's some historical pain there that we need to process.
And once they've identified the sources of these problems, how should couples go about resolving these issues?
Yeah. So I think, look, I would love to say they should just sit down with a cup of tea and have a chat. But I think that, look, depending on how they communicate, if they're good communicators, I would genuinely say that. Like sit down with your partner, carve out some time and space and actually just say, hey, there's been something that I've been holding on to for a few years and I want to have a chat about it with you, and do it in a really gentle way. But for a lot of couples, when we unpack this history, they're shocked. Like one person's been holding on to one event and the other person has no idea that this has been underlying it. So they actually then go through quite an adjustment emotionally as they're coming to terms with this. They can feel quite defensive. And so if there are big things there that you're finding difficult to navigate together, that's when I would be saying go and see a couples therapist who can assist.
Yeah, and some people aren't natural communicators either. They might need a bit of extra help with that. So what sort of challenges does attempting to solve the past issues present?
Lots of challenges. So as I said, like for some people, there's quite a lot of emotion that comes up. So shock for some people is a really big one. And then there's sometimes anger, like a lot of anger, like, well, if this was such a big issue, why didn't you tell me? Because now you've known this and then look at what's happened. Like we've built our relationship on top of this, this breakdown of trust. And it was like the person who didn't know about it is feeling a little bit railroaded. Like I had no idea all this time that this is what you were holding on to. It feels like it's been an unfair playing field.
It's kind of also like I trusted you to tell me about anything that you're experiencing with this relationship. And it's like, how do I know now if you're feeling pain from something? And I just have no idea. Like I'm just gonna be walking around constantly thinking, are you feeling a certain way?
Me?
Yeah. So how, like, what other challenges would that present?
Yeah, I think the other big challenge is then about how, and this is the biggest challenge in any relationship, is whether or not people can actually empathize with the other person's perspective. So we know that no feelings are actually wrong, but our feelings and our experiences of events are quite subjective. So what is painful for me is not necessarily going to be painful for you and vice versa. So the challenge that I often come up against is when we speak to our partner and say, this is what I'm upset about, often we're met with, but why? Like, why would you be upset about that? Or it wasn't such a big thing. So that minimizing of the other person's experience. Thankfully, in the type of work that we do, we're very well trained to assist people to move into that sort of empathic space and be able to see their partner's perspective. And that's a really, really rewarding thing for a couple to experience that, because for a lot of couples, I'm quite used to hearing them say, I've never, ever felt heard or seen by you. This is the most known I've ever felt by you, just sitting in this space, experiencing true empathy and understanding.
Yeah. So it sounds like empathy can do a lot in resolving these issues and, circumventing or rather like just kind of resolving the challenges, essentially. But are there any common misconceptions about addressing the past issues in romantic relationships? Do couples come in with like this idea of what it's going to be like when it's not at all actually that?
Yeah, definitely. I wish if I had a magic wand, I would just take it and I would just let it know that couples therapy is okay. It's safe. Um, Look, a lot of people think that you're going to come into couples therapy and one person's going to be to blame and the therapist is going to side with that person, and then you're just going to be smashed if you've done the wrong thing. And so a lot of people come in with that misconception that it's just going to be you in the firing line, all the things that you've done wrong. But it's not at all how it works. The idea is that, in every problem that there is in a relationship, we've both been a part of that problem. Whether it's I haven't had the confidence to speak up about what was happening for me, maybe my partner hasn't created an environment that's made it safe for me to speak up, So we're always looking at trying to dispel this myth that it's going to be a difficult thing to do. It's actually really quite a gentle, loving process when you get people in to talk about their historical events, and we facilitate couples both being able to have a voice in that space. So what is it that was happening for you? What is it was happening for your partner? And so both parties get to be heard and understood in that space.
And what should couples consider when discussing their relationship histories with each other?
They should consider, one of the things that we talk a lot about in therapy is our enduring personality trait differences, which comes back to something I said before, that who we are as people is made up of everything that's ever happened to us in our life, right? So I'm going to be vulnerable to certain things in a relationship that my partner may not be vulnerable to based on the early life experiences that I've had. So if I'm a child of divorce and I'm married to someone or in a relationship with somebody whose parents are still together, my vulnerabilities are going to be different to your vulnerabilities. And so when we're discussing our own history, it's also really important to remember who you're talking to and the person that you fell in love with and the vulnerabilities that they carry with them. Because if we can start to see our partner's pain, not just through the things that have happened in our own relationship, but where it's hitting on their own vulnerabilities, that's when we can start to develop real deep levels of empathy and understanding for one another.
Yeah, and I suppose on the flip side, it would also be helpful to remember that a lot of our pain points sometimes can stem from our own early life, and to keep that in mind. It's not that our partner is intentionally trying to hurt us or being extra thoughtless or careless. It's just that this is a vulnerable point for us, and so we feel more with that specific kind of action or behavior or something like that. So what advice would you offer to couples who might have qualms about addressing past issues, for the fear of causing further stress in their relationship?
Yeah. What I often say to my couples is that deep intimacy is actually found in going through hard times well together. A lot of people think it's having wonderful holidays, and they're very nice, but they're the icing on the cake.
They are very nice.
They are very nice. I do with them right now. They are very nice, but they're the icing on the cake. And in fact, the research shows us that those lovely holidays or those diamond rings or that extra special anniversary mean absolutely nothing if we can't be present for one another and be attentive to one another in those periods of difficulty throughout our life. And so I would say that if you want true intimacy and depth of intimacy in your relationship, hold your partner's hand and go through something hard together and do it.
That is
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful sentiment, and I'm holding back my tears. Don't look at me. Um, my last question for you.
Yeah.
What are some resources like books, workshops, or tools would you recommend to couples hoping to proactively address these issues?
Yeah. So I would say workshops. The Gottman Institute runs a couple of workshops. So the 7 Principles That Make Marriage Work, which is based on their New York Times bestseller around that same topic. And that actually, there's an intervention that we use in couples therapy that we actually teach also in that workshop, which helps couples get into those early life vulnerabilities and those things that are sort of underneath some of their conflicts. And so I think that's a really wonderful workshop. There's also the Art and Science of Love, which is another Gottman workshop, all around the same sort of content there. In terms of books, one of the most beautiful books, apart from that one that I just mentioned, is Dr. Sue Johnson's book, Hold Me Tight, which looks at just how to, or the importance of creating secure attachment in your romantic relationship. And in the absence of that, what are some of the challenges that we face, and what is it that we can do to build that secure attachment in our relationship? So those 2 resources I really, really enjoy.
That's amazing, and it sounds interesting regardless. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Now we're moving on to the practice/habits section, and this is where we ask you a bit about the everyday application of what you've shared with us. Now, I usually ask this with in the guests' real life, in
Yeah.
that perspective. Are you comfortable with that?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So my first question for you is what is the practice that you do in order to resolve or manage the lingering stress from relationship history?
Yeah. So do you mean like in my own personal
Yes.
life, in my own marriage?
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
It's entertaining because I'm married to a psychologist who's also a couples therapist. And so we should know what we're doing. However, we as people tend to be high on stress. We're high performing couple. We have very high expectations of ourselves and each other, which is not always good in a relationship. And so we only ever fight when we're stressed. And so over the course of our relationship, we have learned to recognize stress within ourselves before it bleeds into our relationship, and then to be able to communicate with one another about that stress that we're sort of carrying. And so it'll be things like waking up one day and knowing that I've got a million things on. And one of the first things that I'll say to my husband is, hey, if I'm a bit snappy at you today, it's not about you. It's actually about X, Y, and Z. And he'll be able to say, what is it that you need from me to sort of help get through this day? So it's like managing that personal stress that we carry and communicating it, because if your partner doesn't know that that's what's actually going on inside of you, they will have a tendency to interpret your stress as something that they have done. So it's managing that. And we do that pretty well most of the time. And I'd say the other thing is, if we have conflict and it's a painful conflict, which we do and everybody does have, we will always come back to it. Every single time we'll come back, we'll sit down and talk about it. I instigate it. He hates it, but he does it because he knows it's the best thing to do. And so we actually spend time processing those conflicts that haven't gone well.
Yeah, that's great, and it makes a lot of sense. Are there any challenges to doing what you've shared with me?
Yeah. Challenges in my own life would be, I think sometimes like when you're trying to work through relationship stresses, and this happens in my relationship, but it also happens in the couples that I work with, we can not always be in sync with when we want to be able to work through a challenge or how we want to work through a challenge. So I'm a big talker and my husband is not. We have a traditional sort of distance or pursuer dynamic in our conflict. I pursue and want to talk things through. My husband's quite a quiet man. And he would rather us just maybe not talk too much and just get back to sitting down and watching something and being happy in each other's space. And so I think that challenge is very real for most couples. There's usually one person, it's not always the female, but there's usually one person that really wants to sit down and talk about it right there and then. They have almost a sense of urgency to do it. And the other person is either not wanting to talk about it then, or maybe not even wanting to talk about it ever. And so the challenge, I think, comes down to being able to respect where both people are at and find a mutually appropriate time, space, and way to do these conversations that's not forcing one person or isolating another person.
That's a great way of putting it. Would you recommend this practice or these practices to everyone?
Yes, definitely. One of the things that the research shows us and that I always encourage my couples to do is try and sit down and have like a weekly check-in where you just sit down and you sort of do a bit of a review of your relationship. What have we done well? What have we done not so well? How is there a problem that we've had this past week that we need to work through and process through, like one of those painful incidents? And doing something like that on a weekly basis is a really, really good practice to get involved in. And it actually prevents the build-up of those emotional injuries that then lead people into couples therapy in a state of crisis.
Yeah.
So if people want to do something preventative, that would be the thing to do.
Yeah, for sure. And I love weekly check-ins. I feel like it gets people on the same page too. So based on your experience, do you have any other recommendations of practice to be combined with, for example, the weekly check-ins or just the thing that you do to manage your stress in order to improve overall as a couple?
Yeah. I'm going to steal directly from the research from the Gottman Institute here. Never stop dating. So life is meant to be fun, right? It's meant to be enjoyable. And one of the saddest things I see is when couples come in and they don't enjoy one another anymore. And there's lots of reasons why that can happen. Often when we have families, young children, high stress jobs, financial pressures and things like that, we neglect spending time together and just actually enjoying one another. But the couples that do really well in their relationship are the ones that never stop dating. So have fun, like whatever that looks like for you and your partner, be diligent about it. Like don't let it go. And I know that's one thing with me and my husband, like we love each other to bits. We laugh our asses off, if I can say that on a podcast. But we laugh a lot and we thoroughly enjoy one another. And we enjoy teasing one another and all those things that you still do when you're dating. And that's something that, it pays massive dividends if you just stay in that space of being able to enjoy one another.
That's adorable and so heartwarming. That's such good advice that I actually haven't really heard before. But it really does keep your mind a little bit fresh with the dating and, you know, just keeping things fun a bit, reminding yourselves why you fell in love with each other. It sounds really important. Thank you for sharing that with us. Now we're moving on to the open mic, and this is your chance to talk about whatever that you wish to talk about that doesn't have to be related to the topic. So the floor is yours. Take it away.
Oh, gosh. All I want to do is talk about the topic.
Go ahead, by all means. If you want to continue talking about the topic, please, Kerry, go ahead and talk about.
Yeah, look, if I had my dream, I'd stand on a mountaintop and scream this to the world. So I may as well scream it on a podcast.
Yes.
Everyone makes sense, is what I want to say. When you take enough time to understand another human being, everyone makes sense. All of their pain makes sense. The way they reacted and why they reacted the way they did always makes sense. And so if there was one thing that I wanted people to hear is that your partner makes sense and you make sense. And all we need to do is work out how to listen and hear in such a way that their story makes sense to us.
Yes.
Because if the world could operate like that, I'm such an idealist, but if the world could operate like that, parents and children would get along, siblings would get along, partners would get along, people would do well in the workplace. because everyone does make sense.
Yeah.
And that's my biggest takeaway from the work that I do is it's a privilege to be able to sit with people and hear their stories, because whenever I get to do that, I'm just reminded of just that common humanity amongst us all, that we all just want to be seen, heard, known and cared about. And if people spend enough time listening and caring, we all make sense. So that's my open mic moment.
Absolutely. That was beautifully said. You're so eloquent and you put things in such an apt manner. So thank you so much, Kerry, for joining us today. If our listeners want to find out more about you and what you do, where can they go?
Yep. So our website is motivatingmarriages.com.au. We're also on Instagram and Facebook. So, yep, that's where we are.
Awesome. Motivatingmarriages.com.au. We'll link that in the show notes along with their social media. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to Reloscope, the Relationship Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. For more episodes like this from 10 different life management perspectives, search LMSL on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts, so you can get updated on everything we have to offer. We have a wide range of topics readily available for you to check out. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps us grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at re.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Marie Stella. Thanks for tuning in.